Wednesdays, but we're always grateful to have opportunity to study together and to be involved in studying the life of Jesus. The reading we had just a moment ago, it reminded me of something. You know, the life of Abraham is so significant to the Bible story, and yet into the 24th chapter, Abraham sends his special servant to find Isaac a wife, and so Isaac marries Rebekah, and so the seed promise is going to continue through Isaac, and in essence, the point of Abraham's life is now done, and so the narrative comes to an end. And that is one of the keys, I think, about studying any character in the Bible, that there's always a purpose for what is given, and then no more than is necessary. We might think, well, why don't we have more about it? Well, it just wasn't necessary for us to know. And so the narrative ends and it picks up, and it's carried on with Isaac for a while, then Jacob, then Joseph, and then we have Exodus. But anyway, we will get into our life of Christ in just a moment, but we are in 1 Chronicles, and our readings have taken us from Sunday through tonight. That's the 5th through the 8th, which is number 126 through 129 on our reading schedule, and that's 1 Chronicles 15 through 1 Chronicles 27. A lot of information in these. Will not take too much time because there's so much in Matthew 24 to cover as well. In these chapters, really in 1 Chronicles, chapters 13 through 17, we have the movement of what particular piece of furniture? The Ark of the Covenant, that's right. And who was the fellow who's tried to steady it when the oxen stumbled? Uzzah, right. And there were just several things. I was talking to somebody after Sunday, several things that were done wrong about all this. It wasn't just Uzzah, and it wasn't just the ox cart, but the priests were not being used, and the matter, there's several things. But in chapter 15, the ark is brought. I mentioned Sunday morning that David emphasizes we need to do things according to the due order, and that's a significant idea. In chapter 16, what happens when the ark comes to Jerusalem? Is it kind of a yah or happiness or sadness? What is it? Celebration. It's a celebration. In fact, David writes a what? A psalm. Yes, in verses 7 through the majority of the chapter down to verse 36. But in chapter 16, there's a celebration of the ark when it comes to Jerusalem. And then in chapter 17, we have David wanting to build what? The temple. But here's the passage he makes a great statement there in verse 1. I dwell in a house of cedar, but the Ark of the Covenant dwells under curtains. That's just not right. There ought to be something better for that. And so he wants to build the temple, but God says no, because he says, why? You're a man of war, you have shed blood, but he says your son Solomon will. The Davidic promises, 3 in number, are mentioned again in verses 10 through 12. The first in verse 10, he says, David, you want to build me a house, but I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to build what? I'm going to build your house. And your house would be the ruling dynasty, the Davidic lineage. David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, all the way down. Then the taking away, and we pick up in Matthew 1, they were taken into captivity. And then after they returned, was there ever a king from that lineage that sat on the throne? No. And yet they are given in Matthew 1 as having a right to the throne, but they never reigned until we get to whom? Jesus Christ. And his rule was not in Jerusalem, but right in heaven at the right hand of God. All right, so you've got, I'm going to make your house a ruling dynasty in verse 10. Verse 11, and it shall come to pass when your days are fulfilled that you must go to be with your fathers. I will set up your seed after you, who shall be of your sons, and I will establish his kingdom. And of course, that would be who? Solomon. And then here's the second promise. He shall build me a house. That would be the what? The temple. And then the third promise, I will establish his throne forever. Now, but Solomon died. The throne would be through Solomon's son, Jesus Christ. It is interesting in verse 13, I will be his father and he shall be my son, is quoted in Hebrews chapter 1 about verse 5 and applied to Jesus Christ. And so there were ways in which God acted towards Solomon and as a father to the son, but this is a special, unique relation that he has. Keep going. 18, 19, and 20, we have a number of David's what? His conquests, that's right, his military victories. And then keep going in 21, David does something wrong here. What does he do? He numbers the people, right? He takes a census. And then in 22, he begins preparations for the building of what? The temple. He's getting the materials ready. He charges Solomon to be faithful to the Lord. He charges the Levites to get in order. Then in 24, he sets in order the sons of Aaron and Levi. Then in chapter 25, the order of the services of song. And they made a big to-do about all of this. And down in verse 6 of chapter 25, all these were under the hands of their father for song in the house of the Lord with cymbals, psalteries, harps. Did God actually order instrumental music in the Old Testament? He actually did, insofar as what was used here. But that's not the New Testament. When we get off, that's another argument. But it met with at least the Lord's approval there. And then in chapter 26, there's the order and the arrangements of those who would be what in the temple? Gatekeepers or doorkeepers and the treasuries, as well as other officials. All right. Comment or question, anybody? Okie doke. I'm enjoying this. We're now in Matthew 24. I wanted to show you some pictures tonight. But before we do, we want to remember the main headings, the main divisions, I should say, of the life of Jesus. Years of preparation, about 30. And then the beginning ministry began with what event? Jesus' baptism, followed by his temptation, and then that beginning ministry there in Judea. Then he goes north to Galilee, better part of 2 years, and then people following him for the wrong reasons, periods of retirement. Then he comes south, what? Closing ministry for about 6 months, and then where we are now, the last week, or the last 10 days. And so on Friday, he arrived at Bethany. We have the anointing by Mary at Simon the leper's house on Saturday night. After the Sabbath had passed, Day of Triumph. And then Monday, his authority was seen by cursing the fig tree and cleansing the temple. Good. And then on Tuesday, which is where we still are, a lot going on Tuesday. Day of conflict. They noticed the fig tree was withered. His authority was challenged, and then he answered it by giving the 3 warning parables. Really, in each of those, he stated the first one with the parable of the 2 sons, but then the wicked husbandman and the marriage feast. 2 of those 3 dealt with the fact that you as a nation are going to do what? You people as a nation of Jews are going to what? You're going to fall. And it's interesting that, you know, the farther we get in his life, the more you've rejected me, you've rejected God's ultimate sacrifice, and hence God is rejecting you. So the 3 warning parables we see all the way on into Matthew 22. Then the entrapment questions he answers. Pharisees and Herodians, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar? Second, Sadducees ask the question about the husband, wife in the resurrection, whose will she be? Then Jesus' unanswerable question was, what think you of the Christ? Whose son is he? And the son of David, and they had that right. And so he quoted 110th Psalm and said, if the Messiah is David's son, how is he his Lord? And that shows he is both human as well as divine or deity. All right, and then the woes on the scribes and Pharisees we talked about in the 23rd chapter. The widow's mites are covered in 2 chapters, and now where we are with the concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. They've gone out now. It's evidently later in the day. They've gone out. They've kind of gone down, and as they're going down, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, the 4 apostles, are with him, according to Mark's account, and they call his attention to how beautiful these what? The stones are. And Jesus just makes a comment. I'll tell you, what's going to happen. None of them will be standing one upon another. All will be thrown down. So then they get up on the Mount of Olives, and they sit down, and they're viewing. We'll show a picture of what it might have looked like. And they said, Lord, what will be, what are the questions? When will be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? When will these things be? And what will be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? Evidently they thought, as massive as these stones were, as beautiful as the temple was, that there must have been some kind of cataclysmic event, some tremendous, colossal, world-shaking movement that would bring all this down. And it would all be in one thing. And Jesus answers it, though, in the way they questioned him, and it wasn't one thing. One thing dealt with the destruction of Jerusalem, and the other with his second coming. So that's where we are. Here he's come down through the Kidron Valley and then up on the Mount of Olives. I had some pictures. I think I showed you these Sunday morning. Some I have had, but I wanted to show you some others. Here's some rock. I've got a picture I took from above looking down. This is a picture I took this is from the Mount of Olives. This would be the Kidron Valley, and this would be the eastern wall. That would be, can you, everybody even in the back see the gate? They're filled in, but can you tell that's kind of a, can you see it, David? Good. That would have been the eastern gate. And then on a kind of an east-west axis that would have gone this way, most of the Jewish scholars said the Temple of Solomon would have been, and then added onto that by the Temple of Herod, would have been right about where my pointer is. It was lined up straight this way. That's known as the Dome of the Rock, the Muslim holy place. Now, what I'm going to do here, this is the eastern wall. The western wall is about somewhere in here. The western wall is known now also as the Wailing Wall. And here's a picture of it. This was taken from above where we went in. This is hyssop growing out of the wall, but some of the larger stones here, you notice the difference in sizes. Larger, a little smaller, and then very small. Some of these were old, the oldest. And then as the temple went under, the wall actually went under repair, they what do we call it? What do we call it when we turn in our plastics and recycle? They recycled a lot of rock there. But this was an interesting sign I took. Dear visitors, you are approaching the holy site of the western wall where the divine presence always rests. Well, I'd question that. Please make sure, but this is why I wanted to copy it. Please make sure you're appropriately and modestly dressed so as to not cause harm to this holy place or to the feelings of the worshipers. Could some churches of Christ use that sign somewhere? Maybe amend it just a little? I think so. Especially the Lord's Supper, other thing. Here we have the men's entrance, the women's entrance going into, this was going on to or into the area of the western wall. Here it is again. I'll give you an idea of the perspective of how large It is. You might notice some people. There's Bob Waldron right there, and Leon Malden, and Bob Hutto. And anyway, we were all together on that trip. It was a wonderful trip. But you can see how massive did somebody say something?
Yeah, is that back to the original height?
Yes, that's supposed to be, well, they think it is. They think it is.
That's actually a retaining wall to hold the other.
Yes, that part is.
To flatten
Exactly.
the top.
Mhm. But some of these are supposed to be rock from the stone that was used, from the first century. Now, this was taken looking the opposite way, and you'll notice a lot of rock that's just down at the, you know what that is?
Where it was thrown down and thrown over.
Exactly. Well, exactly what Jesus said would happen. There's not going to be one stone standing upon another. All will be thrown down. And when some of the people in charge rebuilt, they left a whole lot there, just as kind of for tourists, but as a reminder of what Jesus said. Here's another picture of it, all down in here in this area.
And those are original?
Yes, those would have been original there.
By throwing the building rock off the wall and down lower, it would make it extra hard to rebuild it because you gotta take that stone and move it back up.
And
to the
move it
top.
back up, exactly right. Yeah, but I thought you would be interested in that. Now, this is on the Temple Mount. You remember, the Temple Mount was between 35 and 40 acres. It was, because I live so close, the Western Hills Mall is built, I think, on about 40 acres. And so you get an idea, it's massive. And that's why when people say, well, how there's so many people, the book of Acts mentions 3,000 on the day of Pentecost. In Acts 4, verse 4, there were 5,000 men. How they get together as if they're trying to get squeezed together in a church building about the size of what we have. No, they had acreage to gather on. It was no problem whatsoever. Trees growing. This was our group here. But the paved with rock. Everything was rock, just about. And here's a picture of the Dome of the Rock, which that's the big thing right now. Now, what's significant about this is that this looks toward the eastern gate that I was telling you about. That would be the Mount of what over here? The Mount of Olives. Down below the Kidron Valley. And so the eastern gate is somewhere in here. Well, this gazebo type thing has been built. And that is supposed to be, there's our buddy Al Burns, he was with me. This is supposed to be built about where the temple is that David wanted to build and Solomon did build, on an east-west axis from the eastern gate toward the western wall. And you just get an idea of what it might have looked like. All right, let's see. I thought I had something else. I guess I did.
Still got a question.
Yeah.
It's not like, how close could the Ethiopian eunuch have got to this?
Of course, we don't have, I don't even have a diagram of the temple. He would have made it into the court of the Gentiles, yeah, but no farther. And that's a great point because the Ethiopian, as you know, traveled 1,500 miles one way, and he couldn't actually get into the temple proper. He could get into the gate, the court of the Gentiles, but he could not, because of his being a eunuch for that matter. I thought I had another one, but I guess I didn't. Okay, so the questions were, when will these things, when Jesus said, not one stone will stand upon another, all will be thrown down, then their questions were, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? They thought it was all going to be one thing, but Jesus breaks it down, and he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, the false signs and events that precede its destruction, then the true signs that they could know, you can know when these days are coming. And then it's figuratively described, and then the certainty of it, of judgment based on the fig tree. You can tell what's going to happen based on how a fig tree looks at the various times. Then 34 and 35 and 36, 32 through 35, really the transition. And then in 36, but of that day and hour knoweth no man, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. The uncertainty of it. So really the destruction of Jerusalem provides a type, really a type or a shadow of final judgment. And while they said, when will these things be? What will be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? He takes those things and really the destruction of Jerusalem that he says, don't get carried away by these false signs, but know when it's going to happen. But then, while that's kind of a foretaste of eternal judgment, he says, that day and hour, nobody knows. And there are things about that you can't know. Let's look at it for a second. I put some things, look real briefly at it, then we'll go back and read. Matthew 24, I just want you to notice, as we look at the text itself, in the first 2 verses gives the context. They went out from the temple, and the disciples, and we know from Mark, it was Peter, Andrew, James, and John, came to him showing the buildings of the temple. And that's when he made that statement. Then in verse 3, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, they said, well, when will these things be? What will be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And so Jesus then begins to answer by saying, you be warned not to take, don't get thrown around by false Christ and false teachers. But, verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, then you can know some things. Know that these days are coming. And then in verse 32, from the fig tree learn her parable. And then what you can know that the summer is nigh. Verse 33, when you see all these things, know that he is nigh, even at the doors. Jerusalem's about to be destroyed. But 34 is a key. Jesus said, this generation shall not pass away till all these things be accomplished. In essence, what Jesus said is, what I've been talking about thus far, is going to happen when?
In your lifetime.
Yeah, in your lifetime. What'd you say, Brother Gene?
I said now.
Now, it's in the next few years, within the
36 years.
people. Sir?
About 36 years.
Yeah, or less. If you take about 80, 30. Yeah, you're right, when the Jewish war started. 30, 40 years, we could say easily, and all this would occur. But that's a key, and it's a key transition. Just look at the 34, 5, and 6. This generation shall not pass away till all these things be accomplished. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. There's the certainty of what I have said is going to come to pass. But that's a huge, huge transition. But of that day and hour knoweth no one, not even the angels of heaven, neither the Son, but the Father only. And then he starts talking about the days of Noah, how the people did not know. You don't know. And it's a day, not days. So we'll see that. But 34, I think, provides that transition. Now, how do premillennialists get around all this when it seems so clear? Well, the one way they do that is they will say that the word generation here simply means race. And so the race of the Jews, this race of the Jews will not go out of, this generation shall not pass away. This race of the Jews will not pass away till all things be accomplished. And they say, well, still we have a race of Jews now, and so it's yet in the future for them then. Well, whatever we understand or fail to understand in the first 33 verses, we know that this generation, or those living during Jesus' day, shall not pass away till all these things be accomplished. If they were to expect these things to occur in that generation, how could it be in the future for us now? Well, dispensationalists attempt to avoid the simple force of this by saying that the word generation means race. So as long as the Jewish race continues, at some point, these things Jesus mentioned will occur. Since they believe the Jewish race continues, these events can find fulfillment in the future, that is, as they see it. But this is a misexplanation or a mistranslation of that word. The word generation, Gunai, is defined as the whole multitude of men living at the same time, Thayer says. Herodotus gives the idea of an age, the space of 30 to 33 years, an age of the time ordinarily occupied by each successive generation. It could be 30 to 40. And the King James Version translates it generation 37 times, time 2 times, age 2 times, and nation 1 time. It is never translated race. So it's really it's never translated race. And to build a case on redefining a word is poor scholarship. Jesus' use indicates that what he predicted would take place during the next 30 to 40 years. And it did, around AD 69, AD 70. This is in your notes. There are 2 judgments. In the first 34, 35 verses, you have the judgment on Jerusalem. And then in 36 on into chapter 25, well, I think he catapults over into the idea. Now you ask about when will these things be, what will be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world. The end of the world, when I come eventually in final judgment, then it will be universal, not regional. Haste will accomplish. No, you know, Jesus said here, you need to get out quickly. Hope it's not on the Sabbath day. You know, there'll be great tribulation and so on. All of this relative to the coming of Christ is universal. Don't worry about it, whether it be on the Sabbath day and the gates are closed, or if a woman has a baby that she's nursing, or she's with child. That's not going to have anything to do with that. So there are 2 distinct judgments. Does that make sense? It's just a real, to me, it's not all that complicated. Okay, so here's where we are. Let's do some reading, guys. Matthew 24, let's read verses 3 through 14. And what we want to look for are these false signs and events that will precede the destruction of Jerusalem. Brother Charlie, if you would, 3 through 14.
As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead you. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place. But that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of the birth of pains. Then they will be deliver you to the tribulations, and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because for my name. At that time men will fall away, and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will rise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, then the end will come.
You know, isn't it interesting that when you think about Pentecost in that last verse, Pentecost AD 29, and the gospel was there in Jerusalem for 2, 3, 4 years, and then it spread to Samaria, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and then Paul's work carrying it. That by AD 62 or 3, when Paul wrote Colossians, he said in Colossians 1 about verse 6 and then verse 23, if so be that you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister. By 30 years, the gospel had gone to the then known world. And that's what the Lord refers to. The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a testimony unto all the nations. Then shall the end come. Well, Paul was writing that in Colossians a few years before the destruction of Jerusalem. And so you see again, all of that was happening in the first century. Sometimes I've been asked this question. Why do you think the Lord is giving so much space to the destruction of Jerusalem? What's so significant about it that in my Bible, I start over here and I go all the way to here. It's a long chapter. And then you've got Mark 13 and Luke 21. You've got a lot of ink. Can you stab at it? What do you think? What was the significance of it?
There
It
were a lot of saints.
was absolute end of the Jewish system.
Exactly. What God used the Jew. Remember, this goes all the way back to Genesis chapter what? Abraham, think. Genesis chapter what? Abrahamic promises. Chapter 12. All right, all the way from 12, the land, the nation, the seed promise. The rest of the Bible story, while God did certainly send prophets to Nineveh, in other words, the Jews were the ones that he was working the plan of salvation. You remember in John 4, where for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans, you remember the woman at the well said. And then John inserted there, for salvation is of the Jews. God used the Jews to give that remedial system of the law, types and shadows. And he dealt with them, giving them every advantage. You remember Paul said in Romans, the 3rd chapter, what advantage hath a Jew? For in every way. For God delivered unto them his utterances. His very law was given. So if anybody had a right to know more about God, more about God's character, it would have been the Jews. And yet, as we've seen in so many passages, Acts 7 particularly and others, for the most part, what did they do to God's overtures of love and mercy? They rejected him. And but God didn't choose them because they were better people. God chose them simply to work out his whole scheme of redemption and eventually bring Jesus into the world. But once Jesus came and then they rejected him and the gospel was going to go into the world, was there then a further need to have this group of people as a physical nation through whom he would work out anything else? Absolutely not. And so, Anglo-Israelism and a lot of other ideas that are associated with 1948 and Israel becoming a nation, those ideas govern a lot of foreign policy in the minds of some. But quite frankly, what's over there now is nothing like what we're reading about. Yes, some people may be linked back to them, but they can't tell from genealogical records, because when the temple was destroyed, guess what happened? All those records were obliterated. And so the Jews cannot trace anybody back as a right person for a priesthood or a right person to be a king. It's gone. What God used as a physical nation to give us a system of types and shadows to see more, like Paul said into Timothy, that from a babe thou hast known the sacred writings that are able to make thee wise unto salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. 2 Timothy 3:14, 15. And so all of those were great things, but for the most part they rejected him. And so God now is going to reject them and bring to them really their justice as a nation of people that was just as deserving as the Amorites and the Canaanites and the others in the land of Canaan when Israel actually took them in the days of Joshua. So there's, God is putting an end, and it's almost like here is a gigantic period to this part of the Bible story. And there are passages, again, in the epistles that I think allude to this time. All right, Charlie read those first 14 verses. We got some questions on pages 78 and 79. Did we answer any down there, bottom of page 78, Sunday? Patty, did you, or Janet, y'all usually mark them with? Okay. All right, I'm not going to read all that stuff. Occasion of the discussion. Where was Jesus going? Number 1, bottom of the page. That's right. Out from the temple toward the Mount of Olives. Number 2, next page. Was this a public or private question and answer period? Private, yeah. And the people present were Peter, Andrew, James, and John. That's in Mark's account, Mark 13:3.
And Jesus.
And Jesus, that's right, yes. What impressed the disciples which led to Jesus' brief statement of Matthew 24:2? Note these others. Basically the what?
Size and adornment of the temple.
That's right. The size of the stones, the building, the beauty, the grandeur of the temple, I think is implied in all those words. Barnes quotes Josephus, the Jewish historian. In that temple were several stones which were 45 cubits. Remember, a cubit is about 1.5 feet, so you do the math, almost 70 feet in length, 5 cubits in height, almost 8 feet, and 6 in breadth, around 9 feet. Its beauty and magnificence, no doubt, was awe-inspiring. What then was the great impact of Jesus' brief statement? Something, what, Janet?
What was going to all be destroyed?
Yeah, it was going to be destroyed. It's something tremendously huge and strong will have to happen for that to occur. Since whatever would have to occur would be stupendous for Jesus' statement to come true, what seems to be the disciples thinking about that event or events as seen by their questions? It must be the end of the world. Yeah, must be the end of the world. All right, we've already read, I've got an outline. A, under 1, what warning does Jesus first give? Don't be what? Don't be led astray. Yeah, many will come in my name saying they are the Christ and will try to lead others astray. Man-made and natural calamities will come. What would these man-made and natural calamities include? Well, man-made would be wars, rumors of wars, famine and earthquakes would be natural calamities. What was that? Yes, yes. Do you hear people say, you know, they'll look at Ukraine and look at what's going on in Palestine and say, well, just like the Bible said, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars and nation rising up against.
But there's no signs of the end of the world.
No, there are no signs.
Signs for Jerusalem to end, but not for the end of the world.
Exactly. These words have nothing to do with what's going on over there now. And so just we need to heed the warning. Don't be misled about anything like this. All right, then the sufferings and successes of the disciples. How would some disciples suffer according to verse 9? Some would be what? Delivered up, killed, hated. You read the first several chapters of Acts to see that in living color. How would some Christians treat others during this time? Well, they would even do what? Deliver some up, one to another. They would hate one another. Besides persecution, what else would Christians have to overcome? False prophets, yeah. Because of increased difficulty and lawlessness, how would love among Christians change? It would wax cold. The word wax, a lot of young people don't know what that means. I think, it means to grow. To grow. To wax cold means to grow cold. And you can appreciate that. Guys, when we have difficulties around our own health, our own families, our attention seems to turn outwardly or inwardly. Inwardly, yeah. We think more about ourselves and our own little circle of difficulties, and we don't usually think outside the box and about others. And so because iniquity waxes great, the love of the many shall wax cold. I got some of that wrong there. What promise is given to those who endure? They will be saved. Yeah, that I've heard brethren use this, you just endure to the end and you'll be saved, meaning salvation from sins and saved eternally in heaven. Well, you could use that as an application, and it is a true statement that we need to be faithful to the end. But in the note, this may have primary reference to being saved or spared from the horrors suffered by unbelievers in Judea when the Romans invaded and destroyed Jerusalem. Obviously, the same principle applies to our spiritual salvation eternally, but I don't think that's really the point that he makes here. According to verse 14, what would occur before the end of Jerusalem? We allude to that first. The gospel would be what? Preached to all the nations, yes. And I mentioned Jesus' deity is again plainly seen in this prophetic statement. After Jesus' resurrection, he commissioned his apostles to go into all the world. They began on Pentecost. Even then, Jews out of every nation under heaven were present, and it's evident many who became Christians carried the gospel back to the land of their nativity. Further, through the efforts of Paul and others, by around AD 61 to 63, Paul could affirm the gospel had been preached to every creature which is under heaven. Just a few years after Paul wrote that the gospel had gone throughout the then known world, Jerusalem was destroyed, just as Jesus said. You know, what would this do to people who were reading these words, say around AD 67, 68, when the Jewish-Roman wars were intensifying? It should increase your faith. Jesus had it right. And he was always right. And we've been hearing that Paul's over in Greece. He's all the way to, gospel's been going everywhere in Asia. People have heard the gospel. And you hear that, and then you see all that. It's almost like, you know, you can, we sometimes say you take it to the bank. It's interesting, later on in Matthew 24, let him that reads understand. So they would have a bird's eye view of what was going on. I got about 2 minutes. Yes, ma'am.
Did you say from the time Jesus said that, it was like 30 or 40 years before it?
It would have been 40 years until, yeah, if you think AD 29 or 30, when Jesus, AD 29. And then it's 69 to 70 when all that occurs. 70 usually is considered when it's completely obliterated. So you've got 30 years. 40, get my math right.
But you got Jesus telling them, this is what's going to happen.
Yes.
You got the false prophet saying, no, it's not.
Yes.
No.
And you know, during all that time, we've got a lot of inspired writings that are going on. And so likely Matthew was written. Likely it had to be written for the destruction of Jerusalem, because all this, you know, he makes this in future. Then the bottom of the page, let's just overview it. True signs preceding Jerusalem's destruction, tribulation during those days, and yet there would be no deliverance to come. And then on the page 81, it's figuratively described, highly figurative, sweeping prophetic language. Sun darkened, the moon turned into blood. All of those are kinds of high figurative language to describe overthrow of government. That's basically it. It's used all through the prophets. And every time it's used, it's to show that whether it's Babylon or Egypt or Philistia, whoever it is, when that kind of phraseology is used, it's used to show they're going to fall as a government, as a people. And so that's what he really says about Jerusalem. Did you have your hand up, Patty? Okay. Anybody else? All right. Then the certainty of it, and then the last part. It's a long chapter, but it's so wonderful for us to think about. Like so many things, guys, you have Jesus' physical description of things that show the spiritual judgment at the end of the world. Just like the tabernacle is kind of a prefigure of the church, and the washings of baptism. And you see there's so many types and antitypes, shadows and fulfillment of the shadow and the substance. And it just shows the wisdom of God, the genius of Christ. They're God. And how we ought to trust them for everything they say and make it a part of our lives.
Yes, that's one thing he says, you're going to see this. You know,
Yeah.
I will tell you, you're going to see
This generation will see this. Exactly right. Okay, we'll stop.